All right, buckle up, because today we're diving deep into a pretty intense Piers Morgan uncensored interview.
Oh, this one, yeah.
Yeah, about the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Right.
And, you shared this with us, and it's got all kinds of voices.
Yeah, it does.
Mustafa Barghouti.
President of the Palestinian National Institute.
Right, the president of the Palestinian National Institute.
Yeah.
We've got Jonathan Conricus, former spokesperson for the IDF.
Yeah, familiar name.
And journalist Aaron Matei, among others.
Yeah, and just from looking at that lineup, you can already tell this is going to be a pretty divided conversation.
Oh, yeah.
Just from their backgrounds and where they're coming from.
Exactly. And I think one of the things that I noticed right off the bat was we're going to hear from Barghouti and Conricus, obviously.
Right.
But also, there's an Iranian academic named Mohammad Marandi.
Okay.
And Thomas Hand, who is the father of a former hostage.
Oh, wow.
And I think hearing these more personal stories like Thomas Hand's, I think that's going to really bring home the human cost of this conflict.
Absolutely. And I think that's so important when we're talking about these huge geopolitical issues, right? It's easy to get lost in the abstract, but hearing those stories really reminds us that there are real people whose lives are being impacted by this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Every single day.
So to kind of kick things off, Piers Morgan, he makes this observation that Netanyahu seems to be winning on multiple fronts in the Middle East.
Okay, interesting.
He's talking about like the ongoing conflict in Gaza, the situation in Syria, Israel's actions against Hezbollah and Hamas.
Right.
And I think one of the things that we should kind of maybe unpack a little bit right off the bat is what are these victories?
Yeah, what does winning even mean in this context, right? Because I think from Netanyahu's perspective, he would argue that these actions are absolutely necessary for Israel's security, for protecting their citizens. But I think for Palestinians, the perspective is completely different.
Completely different.
It's not about winning, it's about survival.
Right, and that's, I think, where Barghouti's perspective comes in.
Okay.
Because he doesn't really mince words here.
No.
He calls Netanyahu a war criminal committing genocide.
Wow.
Driven by imperial ambitions.
It's strong language.
Strong language.
And I think it speaks to the depth of anger and resentment that many Palestinians feel. It's not just about disagreeing with policies. It's about a fundamental sense of injustice. A feeling that their very existence is being threatened.
And the word genocide obviously carries a lot of historical weight.
Absolutely. When he uses that word, it evokes a very specific historical context. One that has deep resonance for Palestinians and carries with it a tremendous emotional charge.
Okay, so we've got these drastically different interpretations of events. And then we get into this really tricky issue of casualty figures in Gaza.
Oh, boy. This is where it gets really sensitive.
Yes.
Because Barghouti, he claims that the Palestinian Health Ministry has recorded 55,000 deaths and over 100,000 injuries in Gaza.
Okay.
But then Conricus pushes back, citing a study by the Henry Jackson Society.
Interesting that he brings that up.
Right.
What are the implications of that?
I think he's trying to present a different perspective on the conflict because the Henry Jackson Society is a British think tank with a particular political leaning. And I think it speaks to this larger issue of the difficulty of getting reliable information in conflict zones.
Of course.
All sides present numbers that support their narrative. So it's really hard to know what the true figures are. And I think even more importantly, it raises the question of whether focusing on the exact numbers distracts from the larger issue, which is the immense suffering that's taking place on both sides.
And Matei, the journalist, he makes this really powerful statement.
Okay.
He says, arguing about the death toll is like debating the number of victims in the Holocaust.
Yeah, powerful analogy.
And I think what he's doing there is he's not equating the two situations.
Right.
But he's drawing a parallel. To really highlight
the moral dimension.
The ethical implications
of this debate.
Of this discussion.
Right. Are we so focused on winning the argument that we lose sight of the human cost?
Okay, let's kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about the root of this conflict.
Oh, boy. Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah, and of course, it's a topic of
intense debate.
Huge debate.
From both sides.
So, Barghouti. He frames it as, Israel's occupation and oppression of Palestinians He calls it a 76-year history of ethnic cleansing and denial of basic rights.
Right. And from his perspective, this is about land, resources, and the fundamental right
to exist freely in their own homeland.
Yeah.
So it's a very powerful way to frame it.
Powerful way to frame it. But of course, Henriques has a very different perspective.
Right. He flips the script and puts the blame on what he calls Palestinian rejectionism, arguing that they've repeatedly turned down peace offers and chosen violence instead.
Right. And this is something that I think we really need to kind of unpack.
Absolutely.
Because this gets to the heart
the whole history
of the debate.
Of negotiations.
So we hear these terms thrown around a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Camp David Accords, Israeli disengagement from Gaza.
Right.
But what do they actually mean?
Right. And why are they relevant?
Yeah, why should people care about these things?
Yeah, exactly. Because they're not just abstract historical events.
Right.
They have a direct impact on the situation today.
So let's start with Camp David.
Okay, back in 2000.
Okay.
This was a major attempt at peace. Led by President Clinton. But it ultimately collapsed.
Yeah.
And the reasons for that are still hotly debated.
Right.
Some say the Palestinians didn't make enough concessions. Others say the deal was inherently unfair and didn't address their core grievances.
Right.
So it's seen by some as a missed opportunity.
Yeah.
By others as evidence of this deep mistrust and these conflicting goals.
Yeah. Decades of this.
That have plagued this conflict for so long.
What about Israeli disengagement from Gaza?
Okay, so that was 2005.
Okay.
This was when Israel unilaterally withdrew its settlers and military from the Gaza Strip. And it was a bold move.
Yeah.
Presented as a step towards peace.
Okay.
But it also led to Hamas gaining control of Gaza, which further complicated things and has contributed to ongoing tensions.
Right.
So, it's this backdrop of failed peace attempts, political maneuvering, escalating violence.
Yeah, and then you throw in Iran's role.
Oh, yeah. Can't forget about Iran, which adds another layer of complexity.
Absolutely.
Right, because Barghouti,
representing the Palestinian view, he dismisses Iran's involvement.
Like it's a distraction.
Yeah, like it's a way for Israel to shift blame and avoid addressing the core issues of the conflict.
Right, but Henriques...
Oh, he sees it very different.
Paints a very different picture.
Yeah, he argues that Iran is a central driver of regional instability, funding and supporting groups like Hezbollah and Hamas.
So we've got these, dramatically different interpretations of history.
Right.
Two completely opposing views on the root causes. And now we're bringing in Iran.
It's like a geopolitical thriller.
Yeah, it's getting complicated.
Buckle up because it's about to get even more interesting.
Oh, you're killing me.
We're going to hear directly from the Iranian perspective.
All right. Well, I guess we'll have to wait for part 2 for that.
You'll have to stay tuned.
But I think we've uncovered some fascinating insights.
Oh, absolutely. So far, and I'm really curious to hear what you as our listener find most compelling about this interview so far.
Yeah, what stands out to you?
What questions are swirling in your mind?
Hold on to those thoughts because we're going to keep unpacking this in part 2.
Yes, stay tuned for part 2.
Okay, so let's get into that Iranian perspective we were talking about earlier. So they bring in Mohammad Marandi, this Iranian academic, and he doesn't hold back.
No.
He talks about, Iran's growing strength on the world stage. And he even specifically denies any involvement in assassinations.
Okay.
Even referencing the allegations related to former President Trump.
Yeah, and it's interesting because he really projects this image of strength and confidence. But it makes me wonder if that's partly in response
for sure.
to all the pressure that Iran's been under. Sanctions, international isolation.
Absolutely.
But maybe they're trying to project strength.
Yeah, trying to overcompensate.
When maybe they're feeling a little bit...
Vulnerable?
I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to remember,
Yeah.
Iran has been dealing with a really tough geopolitical situation for decades. Economic hardship,
Yeah.
political isolation,
Yeah.
military threats. So it makes sense that they would want to project this image of, strength and resilience.
Yeah.
Especially when they're talking to a Western audience.
So how does this all tie in
Good question.
to Iran's broader strategy in the region?
Yeah.
We hear so much about their support for groups like Hezbollah,
Right.
Hamas, the Houthis.
Yeah.
What are they trying to achieve?
Well, Iran sees itself as a major player in the Middle East, and they're definitely trying to expand their influence and counter what they see as Western dominance.
Right.
And their support for these groups is a key part of that.
Okay.
They provide financial aid, military training, political backing, and this allows them to exert leverage in these different regional conflicts and push back against what they see as Israeli and American aggression.
So it's not just about ideology or religious ties.
It's much more strategic than that.
It's about power.
Yeah.
It's about alliances.
Absolutely.
Iran is playing the long game.
Yeah, they're thinking long-term.
Trying to reshape the whole geopolitical landscape.
To their advantage.
To their advantage.
Exactly.
And so this brings us back to the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Right. Full circle.
Because Iran sees Israel as a threat.
Right.
To its own security and to the broader Muslim world.
Right.
And so by supporting groups like Hamas, they're indirectly engaging in that conflict and trying to weaken Israel's position.
Yeah, it's multidimensional.
Oh, it's a tangled web.
Yeah, a lot of moving pieces. It's hard to keep track of it all.
But I think we need to kind of bring things back down to earth a little
bit.
Remember the human cost?
Absolutely, because it's easy to get caught up in the geopolitics. But at the end of the day, it's real people.
Real people who are suffering. And that's the Thomas Hand's story really comes in. You know, he's the father of Emily, the former hostage in Gaza.
Right.
And to hear him talk about his experience,
Yeah.
his daughter's trauma,
it's heartbreaking.
His fears about rising anti-Semitism, it really, I think, brings that human cost
into sharp focus. Yeah.
And you know, Emily,
yeah,
she's no longer whispering all the time. She's not afraid to leave the house. But you can tell that she's still carrying the scars.
The trauma is still there.
Yeah.
It doesn't just go away overnight.
And it speaks to this larger point.
Yeah.
About the impact of these hostage situations.
Yeah. Right.
It's not just about the physical confinement.
It's about the psychological toll.
Right.
The fear, the uncertainty.
Yeah.
The loss of control. And it can really change a person and their view of the world.
And you know, it's not just Emily.
Right.
I mean, he talks about his friend, Lean Sharabi, whose family was almost entirely wiped out.
Oh, my God.
In the conflict.
Wow.
And her husband is still a hostage in Gaza.
It's unimaginable.
And you can just hear the anguish in his voice when he talks about this.
It's palpable.
Yeah.
That pain.
The desperation.
And that sense of helplessness that so many families feel.
And it's clear that he's lost faith in diplomacy.
Yeah, he's come to the conclusion
that's only force.
That force is the only way
we'll get Hamas
to release the hostages.
And
it's a hardline stance.
Yeah.
But it comes from a place of deep pain and disillusionment.
He sees the violence.
He's experienced it firsthand. He's lost people he cares about.
And then you add in the whole thing with Ireland.
Yeah, this is fascinating.
Where you know he's an Irishman.
Yeah.
And he talks about
this rising tide of anti-Semitism in Ireland.
And his friends are afraid to speak out in support of Israel.
Yeah, for fear of backlash.
Right.
And it shows how this conflict extends far beyond
the borders of Israel and Palestine.
Yeah, it has global implications.
Right.
It fuels tensions in communities all over the world.
Yeah.
This fear that he describes, it's a symptom of that.
Of the polarization.
Yeah.
The intolerance.
And it's compounded by this decision to close the Israeli embassy in Ireland.
Right, because of these extreme
they see as
anti-Israel policies.
Yeah.
And he feels like that's justified.
Yeah.
He's like, it's becoming dangerous.
Yeah, it's dangerous to support Israel.
To support Israel in some places.
Yeah, and this raises a really thorny issue. Yeah. Because on the one hand, we have to acknowledge that anti-Semitism is real.
Right.
And it's a serious problem.
Yeah.
But we also have to be careful.
Right.
Not to conflate criticism of Israeli government policies with anti-Semitism.
Right.
You can disagree with a government without hating an entire people.
So where's the line?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a tightrope walk.
Absolutely.
And I think, you know, when Hand closes, he makes this plea for a deal.
Right.
For the return of the hostages.
Yeah.
For peace in the region.
For peace.
And it's a really powerful reminder of what's at stake.
Yeah.
You know, it's a call for empathy.
For understanding.
For understanding.
For compassion.
For a way out.
Yeah, a way out of this cycle of violence.
And it's a message that
transcends political affiliations.
Yeah, it's a human message.
It's a human message.
And so, as we continue this deep dive, I want you, our listener, to keep that question in mind.
Yeah.
You know, we've explored the geopolitics, the different perspectives. We've seen the human toll.
Right.
But now let's think about
solutions.
So, you know, we've heard a lot about the blame game in this conflict. Each side pointing fingers at the other.
Right.
And, you know, Conricus, he argues that the Palestinians, they've repeatedly rejected peace offers.
Okay.
Implying that they're the main obstacle to a resolution.
Right.
But then Matei pushes back on that. He says Israel has never really offered a deal that would give Palestinians a viable and independent state.
It's a good point.
And he brings up Camp David specifically.
Okay.
And he says even the Israeli foreign minister at the time admitted that if he were Palestinian, he would have rejected the deal.
That's a pretty telling statement. Yeah. It suggests that even within the Israeli government, there were doubts about the fairness of the offer and whether it truly addressed the Palestinians' needs.
So what would a real agreement actually look like?
It's $1 million question, right?
Yeah.
I mean, some of the key issues, settlements, borders, of return for Palestinian refugees.
For Palestinians.
A genuine peace deal would have to address those things.
Okay, so like what specifically?
Okay, so for example, Israel would need to halt settlement expansion in the occupied territories. They'd have to agree to borders that reflect the pre-1967 lines, and they'd have to acknowledge the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes.
But those are all huge sticking points for Israel.
Oh, absolutely. Incredibly sensitive issues. I mean, they see settlements as essential
for their security. They say the pre-1967 borders
are indefensible. And they worry that the return of millions of refugees would have fundamentally changed the character of the country.
So where do we go from here?
I mean, honestly, this interview doesn't offer any easy answers.
Right.
But it does make us confront the hard questions.
It does.
It shows us just how complicated this conflict really is.
The historical baggage, the narratives.
The entrenched narratives.
Yeah, and I think maybe the first step is just acknowledging how difficult this is.
Acknowledging the pain on both sides.
Yeah.
And resisting the urge to oversimplify things.
It's like peeling back the layers
of an onion.
And each layer
reveals more complexity.
And I think maybe that's the point.
Yeah.
There's no quick fix.
No magic solution.
It's going to take empathy, a willingness to have those tough conversations.
And maybe, just maybe,
if we can get past the blame game, start listening to each other. We can start to imagine a different future. A future where peace is actually possible. It's a long shot.
It's a long shot, but
it's worth striving for.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, our listener, with one final thought.
Okay.
We've heard from all these different voices, politicians, academics,
journalists,
a father whose life has been deeply affected by this. But what about you?
What are your thoughts?
What are your thoughts on the Israel-Palestine conflict?
What do you see as the biggest obstacles to peace?
And what can we do
to move forward?
To build a better future?
We encourage you to keep exploring these questions.
Challenge your assumptions.
Engage in respectful dialogue.
Because ultimately, the search for peace, it's not just a political endeavor.
It's a human one.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
And we'll see you next time.